My name is Madeline. I am 32 years old. On the morning of my 30th birthday, I quietly moved every single dollar of my inheritance into a strict, irrevocable trust. It was the most crucial decision of my entire existence. I had no idea just how urgently I would need that financial fortress, because a mere 2 hours later, my mother slid a daunting legal document across my kitchen counter with a predatory smile. She demanded total control over the money my late father had left me. She thought she had me trapped in a corner. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I had already locked the trap from the outside. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member to protect your own future. My 30th birthday began like any other Tuesday in my downtown Chicago apartment. The sun had not yet risen over the city skyline, but I was already awake sitting at my kitchen island with a mug of black coffee cooling beside my laptop. As a lead data analyst for a rapidly expanding health tech company, my brain functioned best in the quiet hours of dawn. I was deeply engrossed in debugging a complex data sequence for a critical software launch scheduled for the following week. The rhythmic clacking of my mechanical keyboard was my daily meditation. My apartment, with its clean lines and minimalist decor, was my personal sanctuary. It was a space governed entirely by logic, precision, and verifiable facts, standing in stark contrast to the emotional turbulence that defined my family. My father was a man who understood both finance and human nature perfectly. He passed away when I was 20. He knew precisely who my mother Lydia really was behind her manicured country club facade. To protect my future, he had established a trust fund specifically in my name, structured to fully vest the exact moment I turned 30. He knew that by 30 I would be old enough and established enough to defend myself against my mother and her relentless financial control. That day had finally arrived. The trust contained $1.5 million. It was a sum of money that represented not just financial security, but absolute independence. The heavy, aggressive thud of my front door unlocking shattered my morning focus. Only one other person possessed the spare key to my apartment, and the sheer audacity to use it before 7 in the morning without knocking. My mother breezed into my kitchen like a hurricane wrapped in an immaculate cashmere trench coat. She carried a designer handbag that cost more than my first car, and her face was fixed in a bright artificial smile that completely failed to reach her cold, calculating eyes. Without offering a single word of greeting or wishing me a happy birthday, she marched straight to my kitchen island. She dropped a thick, stapled stack of legal papers directly onto my keyboard, completely obscuring my screen and interrupting my code. The bold, capitalized letters at the top of the first page read, "Power of Attorney." I calmly pushed the heavy document aside and used a quick keyboard shortcut to save my work. I did not flinch, and I did not let my heart rate spike. In my profession, I spent my days analyzing behavioral patterns and predicting outcomes based on raw data. My mother was nothing more than a highly predictable algorithm, and I already knew exactly what this unannounced visit was about. Lydia smoothed the front of her coat and looked down at me with an expression of practiced condescending warmth. She informed me that since I was officially turning 30 today, the trust fund my father had left behind was finally dissolving into my personal accounts. She spoke to me slowly, using the patronizing tone one might use with a confused child. She claimed that someone with a demanding tech job like mine would simply be too overwhelmed and inexperienced to manage a $1.5 million portfolio. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the power of attorney document, instructing me to sign on the bottom line. She insisted that she needed to take over the management of the assets for the overall good of the family. In Lydia and her vocabulary, the phrase "the good of the family" was simply a polite translation for her own bank account and the extravagant lifestyle of my younger sister Chelsea. I looked up at her, maintaining complete clinical detachment. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer any emotional justifications or defensive excuses. I simply looked her dead in the eyes and said no. I told her the money belonged to me. It was intended for my future, and I would be managing every single cent of it myself. The transformation in her demeanor was instantaneous and chilling. Lydia dropped her fake maternal warmth in a fraction of a second. The polite, affluent facade cracked, revealing the ruthless, controlling woman underneath. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated resentment. She leaned heavily over the granite counter, invading my personal space, and decided to play what she firmly believed was her ultimate trump card. Her voice dropped to a harsh, threatening whisper. She told me that if I refused to sign the documents right this second, she would immediately remove me from her premium family health insurance plan. She smiled maliciously, reminding me of how obscenely expensive my daily asthma medication and specialist visits were. She boasted that without her generous coverage, my medical bills would drown me within months, draining my paycheck and forcing me to beg her for help anyway. She stood tall, crossing her arms, waiting for the panic to set in. She expected me to crumble under the weight of financial anxiety. She fully expected me to reach for a pen and sign away my inheritance just to keep my basic health care intact. I let a few seconds of absolute silence stretch between us. I watched the pulse beating in her neck as she waited for my surrender. What Lydia did not know, because she had never once bothered to ask about my career or my life, was that I had removed myself from her insurance plan over 4 years ago. My corporate benefits package at the tech firm was incredibly comprehensive, covering every single medical expense and prescription I required. Her ultimate threat was completely meaningless. It was a desperate bluff relying on outdated information. I looked at the power of attorney document, then back up to her furious face. I did not tell her about my corporate insurance. I did not give her the satisfaction of an explanation. I simply turned back to my laptop, pulled up my coding environment, and began typing again. I told her the door was exactly where she left it and that she could see herself out before I called building security. Before my mother could formulate a response to my dismissal, the front door swung open again. She had apparently left it unlocked, allowing the second wave of her premeditated ambush to simply waltz into my apartment. The sharp, aggressive click of designer heels against my hardwood floor announced the arrival of my younger sister, Chelsea. Close behind her, trailing an air of unearned superiority, was her husband, Trey. Chelsea was 27 and had never worked a consecutive 40-hour week in her entire life. She was dressed in a tailored silk blouse and carried a bag that cost more than most people earned in a fiscal quarter. Trey followed her, projecting the highly curated aesthetic of a Silicon Valley visionary. He was a tall, striking African-American man, wearing a minimalist black turtleneck paired with limited-edition sneakers that screamed desperate tech wealth. He carried himself with the bloated arrogance of a man who firmly believed his own pitch deck. Without a single word of greeting, Trey bypassed the kitchen island entirely. He walked directly to my refrigerator, pulled the handle, and began rummaging through the shelves. He casually grabbed a bottle of imported sparkling water, popped the cap, and took a long, slow swig. Chelsea, meanwhile, glided over to my pristine living room and draped herself across my custom linen sofa, completely oblivious to the tension radiating through the room. Lydia immediately shifted her posture, transforming from a cornered predator into a proud matriarch. She looked at Chelsea and Trey with sickening adoration. Trey leaned against my granite countertop, invading my workspace just as Lydia had done minutes earlier. He pointed the bottle of sparkling water at me using his best venture capitalist pitch voice. He said they needed to talk numbers. He casually tossed out buzzwords like burn rate, scalability, pivot, and runway. He spoke rapidly, trying to overwhelm me with tech bro jargon, assuming I was just a naive corporate drone who would be dazzled by his entrepreneurial buzz. He finally arrived at his main point. His health tech startup was apparently on the verge of revolutionizing the industry, but they had hit a slight cash flow bottleneck. He announced with absolute brazen entitlement that they needed $500,000 by the end of the business week. I stared at him. I did not blink. As a lead data analyst working in actual health tech, I knew exactly what his startup was doing. They were building a redundant app with a terrible user interface and zero market viability. Their engagement metrics were an industry joke. His company was bleeding cash faster than a severed artery, and no legitimate venture capital firm would ever touch them. Trey smiled, flashing perfectly white teeth. He told me that Lydia had already assured him the capital was secured. He explained that since my trust fund was officially unlocking today, it was the perfect opportunity for me to become a silent angel investor in his company. He actually had the audacity to call it a late wedding gift. He insisted that family invests in family, and that my financial contribution would permanently solidify their future. Chelsea chimed in from the sofa, inspecting her freshly manicured nails. She whined about how stressed Trey had been lately dealing with his board of directors. She used that grating, high-pitched tone she always reserved for demanding money. She told me that I did not really need $1.5 million anyway. She pointed out that I just sat at a computer all day, while Trey was actively building an empire. She said it was only fair, since Dad left the money to me, that I share it with the people who were actually carrying on the family legacy. She genuinely believed her husband was the next tech billionaire, and that I owed them my financial backing simply because we shared a bloodline. My inner monologue categorized their behavior rapidly. Lydia was the architect attempting to use my money to fund her favorite child's lavish lifestyle. Trey was the grifter utilizing emotional manipulation and familial obligation to cover up his gross financial incompetence. Chelsea was the willing accomplice entirely detached from the reality of hard work or personal accountability. They had marched into my home uninvited, drank my water, sat on my furniture, and demanded $500,000 with the casual ease of ordering a cup of coffee. I looked closely at Trey. I analyzed the subtle signs of his desperation. I noticed the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning in my apartment. I watched the frantic, rapid tapping of his left foot against the base of my kitchen island. He was putting on a masterclass in overconfidence, but the raw data presented a completely different reality. A man with a solid business model does not corner his sister-in-law at 7 in the morning to demand seed capital. A real visionary does not use his mother-in-law as a financial enforcer. He was absolutely terrified. The walls were closing in on his facade, and he viewed my inheritance as his personal bailout package. Chelsea, oblivious to her husband's underlying panic, continued her endless monologue from the living room. She loudly declared that they were looking at purchasing a new vacation home in Aspen, and the current cash flow issue was putting a hold on their escrow. She had the profound lack of self-awareness to complain about a delayed luxury real estate purchase while actively attempting to extort my life savings. She told me to hurry up and sign the papers because they had a brunch reservation at 11, and Trey needed to get back to the office to lead a strategy meeting. She treated my massive trust fund as a minor administrative hurdle in her busy social calendar. Lydia placed a reassuring hand on Trey's shoulder, projecting total unity. She looked at me with cold, expectant eyes. She reminded me that we were all in this together. She stated that holding on to the money would cause a permanent rift in the family, and that I would be entirely responsible for destroying my sister's happiness. The psychological trap was perfectly laid out. If I refused, I was the villain attempting to ruin Trey's brilliant career and Chelsea's perfect marriage. If I signed, I became their permanent financial hostage. Trey took another sip of water and pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket. He placed it directly on top of the power of attorney document my mother had brought. He tapped the paper, telling me to just sign the authorization so Lydia could initiate the wire transfer by noon. He promised me a fraction of a percent in equity as a token of his gratitude. He spoke as if he was doing me a massive favor by allowing me to fund his sinking ship. I looked at the silver pen resting on the legal document. I looked at Trey's arrogant smile, at Chelsea's bored expression, and at Lydia's triumphant posture. I felt no anger. Anger implies a loss of control. I felt nothing but absolute chilling clarity. I reached out and picked up the silver pen. Trey's smile widened, and Lydia let out a soft sigh of relief. They thought they had won. They thought the battle was over before it had even truly begun. I rolled the heavy silver pen between my fingers, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Trey stood up a little straighter, his chest puffing out with the arrogant satisfaction of a man who believed he had just successfully bullied a woman into submission. Lydia clasped her hands together in front of her, a picture of manufactured maternal grace. From the living room, Chelsea let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, as if my compliance was simply a tedious chore she had been forced to oversee. They were all waiting for the scratch of ink on paper. They were waiting for me to sign away my future. I did not uncap the pen. Instead, I casually tossed it back onto the granite countertop, where it clattered loudly and slid right back to Trey. His smug smile froze instantly. Lydia dropped her clasped hands, her posture stiffening. The sudden sharp sound of the metal hitting the stone seemed to echo in the quiet apartment, cutting through their thick delusion. "I am not signing that document," I stated. My voice was entirely flat, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. It was the exact tone I used when informing a software engineering team that their code had catastrophically failed a stress test. And I am certainly not investing $500,000 into a company that is currently hemorrhaging capital with absolutely no viable product to show for it. Trey bristled, his tech bro bravado instantly flaring up to mask his underlying terror. He slammed his hand against the counter and began loudly protesting that I simply did not understand the market. He claimed I was making the biggest financial mistake of my life by passing up on ground floor equity. He demanded to know how I could be so selfish when my own family was offering me a golden ticket to generational wealth. Lydia stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, unyielding slits. She reminded me of her earlier threat to cut off my medical insurance. She raised her voice, attempting to physically intimidate me by crowding my space. She commanded me to pick up the pen and do exactly as I was told, declaring that she was still my mother, and she knew exactly how to manage this massive influx of wealth. I let them exhaust their pathetic outrage. When they finally paused to take a breath, I delivered the reality check they were entirely unprepared for. "You are all operating under a fundamentally flawed assumption," I explained, leaning forward slightly to ensure they heard every single syllable. "You assume the money is sitting in a standard checking account waiting for my signature. It is not." I watched their faces contort in synchronized confusion. I outlined the exact timeline of events. I told them that at 8 in the morning, my brilliant and highly proactive trust lawyer Harrison had executed a pre-planned legal maneuver. The very second the clock struck midnight and the $1.5 million officially vested into my name, it was immediately and automatically transferred out of my personal estate. The entire sum I enunciated clearly has been legally locked into a strict irrevocable trust. The words hit the kitchen like a physical shockwave. As a data analyst, I deal in airtight structures, and there is nothing more airtight than an irrevocable trust. I explained the mechanism to them with absolute clinical precision. I told them how Harrison and I had spent the last 6 months drafting the paperwork, anticipating this exact scenario. We had meticulously constructed a financial bunker. Unlike a revocable trust, which I could alter or dissolve at will, an irrevocable trust meant I had willingly surrendered absolute control over the assets. I was no longer the legal owner of the $1.5 million. The trust was the owner. I even ensured we included a robust spendthrift clause, meaning that no creditor could ever come after the trust principal to satisfy any debts they might try to fraudulently assign to me. I legally cannot withdraw $500,000 even if I wanted to. I continued watching the confident facade rapidly peel away from Trey. The trust is managed by an independent fiduciary. Harrison controls the disbursements entirely. Furthermore, the foundational charter of this specific trust contains incredibly strict stipulations regarding asset allocation. It explicitly prohibits any high-risk private equity investments, unverified startup funding, or undocumented personal loans to family members. The vault is locked, and I threw away the key. Trey staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His limited edition sneakers squeaked sharply against the hardwood floor. His dark complexion turned an ashen gray, and he gripped the edge of the kitchen island, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to process the fact that his bailout had just evaporated into thin air. He began muttering to himself, frantically shaking his head and pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. He frantically swiped at the screen, entirely consumed by the realization that his investors were going to tear his life apart. The confident visionary had instantly crumbled into a desperate man facing total financial ruin. Chelsea bolted upright from her comfortable position on my custom linen sofa. The reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick bubble of entitlement. She began stomping her foot against the rug like a petulant toddler. Her voice, shrill and panicked, echoed through the apartment as she demanded to know how they were supposed to close on their Aspen vacation home without my money. She screamed that I was deliberately ruining her life and sabotaging her marriage. She looked at her mother, expecting Lydia to magically fix the situation with a wave of her hand, just as she had done for Chelsea's entire life. But Lydia could not fix anything. My mother stood completely paralyzed, her mouth slightly open. She pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded that I call Harrison right this second to undo the paperwork. I smiled a cold, calculated smile and informed her that piercing an irrevocable trust would require a complex court order, a massive legal team, and years of litigation that none of them could afford to finance. The immaculate matriarchal mask had been violently ripped away, leaving behind a hyperventilating woman who realized her ultimate tool of manipulation had been rendered entirely useless. She stared down at the power of attorney document sitting on my counter. It was nothing more than worthless paper, a failed weapon in a war she had already lost. She had tried to corner me, but she had walked blindly into an impenetrable legal fortress. She began gasping for air, her chest heaving as the sheer magnitude of her failure crushed her lungs. I did not stay to comfort them. I did not offer any apologies or seek any compromises to soften the blow. I calmly reached for the back of one of my kitchen stools and picked up my tailored navy blazer. I slid my arms into the sleeves, adjusting the collar with meticulous care, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle. I picked up my leather work bag from the counter and slung it over my shoulder, checking my watch to ensure I was still perfectly on schedule for my morning data integration meetings. I looked at the three of them one last time, taking a mental snapshot of their absolute defeat. Trey was pacing the floor, gripping his phone like a lifeline, while sweat beaded heavily on his forehead. Chelsea was frantically biting her freshly manicured nails, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated panic as she continued to whine about her Aspen property. Lydia was clutching the edge of the granite island, her face a sickly shade of pale as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs, completely shattered by the loss of her financial dominance. They were entirely consumed by their own self-inflicted catastrophe. I stepped around them, walked straight to my front door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, leaving the three antagonists trapped in the suffocating reality of my kitchen while I headed to work. The crisp morning air of downtown Chicago felt incredibly refreshing as I marched toward my office building. The adrenaline from the kitchen confrontation still hummed in my veins, but my mind had already transitioned into corporate mode. I walked through the revolving glass doors of my company headquarters, perfectly on schedule. The towering atrium buzzed with the usual rush hour energy of executives and developers, grabbing their morning caffeine. I joined the short line at the artisanal coffee shop, nestled in the corner of the lobby. It was my daily ritual, a simple black coffee to officially start my workday. I stood in line, mentally reviewing the data migration parameters I needed to present at my 10 o'clock meeting. I felt an unprecedented sense of lightness. I had successfully insulated my primary financial assets from my toxic family. I was secure, I was untouchable, or so I thought. I reached the front of the line and ordered my standard $4 drip coffee. The barista, a friendly college student who knew my order by heart, punched it into the point-of-sale system. I pulled my sleek corporate debit card from my wallet and tapped it against the wireless reader, expecting the familiar chime of a successful transaction. Instead, the terminal let out a sharp, obnoxious beep. The screen flashed a bright red error message indicating the transaction was declined. The barista frowned and tapped the screen a few times. He apologized, claiming the network might be experiencing a minor glitch, and asked me to tap the card again. I obliged, pressing the plastic against the reader a second time. The same sharp beep echoed over the ambient noise of the coffee shop. The bright red error message appeared once more. A line of impatient, caffeinated professionals was beginning to form behind me. The barista gave me a sympathetic but awkward look, suggesting I might need to try a different payment method. My brow furrowed in genuine confusion. I was a senior data analyst, making a six-figure salary with excellent credit and absolutely zero debt. There was absolutely no logical reason for a $4 transaction to fail. I quickly handed the barista a $5 bill from my coat pocket, told him to keep the change, and stepped away from the counter holding my coffee. I walked over to a quiet high-top table near the window. I pulled out my phone and used facial recognition to unlock my primary banking application. I navigated straight to my emergency savings account. This was a specific checking account I had maintained since my freshman year of college. It held exactly $12,000. I kept it separate from my main corporate accounts, serving as a liquid safety net for immediate access. It was a financial buffer I had built dollar by dollar during my early 20s by working late shifts and living on instant noodles. As the dashboard loaded, the screen refreshed to display the current balance, $0.00. I stared at the bold black numbers on the glowing screen. My analytical brain immediately began running diagnostics, ruling out banking errors, identity theft, or compromised card numbers. I clicked into the transaction history to trace the exact movement of the missing funds. There was only one pending transfer initiated less than 45 minutes ago. $12,000 had been fully wired out of my account. I checked the destination routing number. It belonged to Lydia. A cold realization washed over me. I had completely forgotten that this specific college account was originally opened as a joint checking account when I was 18 years old. I had never bothered to go into a physical bank branch to officially delink my mother from the paperwork. Technically, her name was still attached to the account, granting her legal access to initiate transfers. I clicked on the transaction details to view the transfer memo. There, attached to the digital wire, was a custom note typed out by Lydia herself. It read, "Back pay for raising you." I gripped my phone. The sheer petty vindictiveness of the message was astounding. This was not a calculated financial strategy. This was the desperate thrashing of a narcissist who had just realized she had lost the grand prize. Having failed to extort $1.5 million from my trust fund, Lydia had immediately scrambled to inflict whatever minor damage she could manage. She had remembered the old joint account, logged in, and drained my emergency savings just to prove she still possessed some fraction of power over my life. She wanted me to panic. She wanted me to call her screaming and crying. She wanted to force me into a negotiation where she held $12,000 hostage in exchange for my compliance on the larger trust fund issue. A flash of intense, blinding anger sparked in my chest. My mother had just stolen the safety net I had bled for during my hardest years. For a fraction of a second, the emotional betrayal threatened to overwhelm my logic. I pictured the smug satisfaction on her face as she clicked the transfer button, believing she had finally punished me for my insubordination. But I brutally suppressed the emotion before it could manifest into a physical reaction. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter liquid ground me back in reality. I did not text her. I did not call her. Anger is a useless metric. It clouds judgment and leads to tactical errors. Lydia thought she had dealt me a punishing blow. She thought this petty theft would bring me to my knees. But looking at the digital transaction record, I realized she had just handed me a loaded weapon. By draining that account out of pure spite, she had crossed a massive legal boundary. I locked my phone, slipped it into my pocket, and walked toward the elevator bank. My mother had just escalated the war from emotional manipulation to tangible financial warfare. I was going to let her fall right into her own trap. I completed my workday with the exact same rigorous efficiency I applied to every data migration project. I did not allow my mother's petty theft to distract me from my responsibilities. I led my 10 o'clock strategy meeting flawlessly. I finalized the software integration protocols. I ate my lunch while reviewing quarterly analytics. By the time I logged off and packed my laptop into my leather satchel, my mind was sharp and fully compartmentalized. The $12,000 missing from my college account was merely a new data point in an ongoing legal equation. I took the elevator down to the lobby and hailed a cab back to my apartment building, anticipating a quiet evening, to draft an email to Harrison regarding the stolen funds. The cab dropped me off in front of my building just as the evening rush hour traffic began to snarl along the street. I walked through the lobby, nodded to the doorman, and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for my floor. The ride up was entirely unremarkable. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped out onto the familiar carpeted hallway. My forward momentum stopped instantly. Lining the hallway right outside the door to my apartment was a barricade of heavy-duty black contractor trash bags. There were at least 15 of them bulging irregularly and carelessly piled against the pristine wallpaper. Beside the bags lay a haphazard stack of cardboard boxes. One of the boxes had split open at the corner, spilling its contents onto the floor. I recognized the spine of a vintage textbook I had owned since graduate school. I walked slowly toward my front door, my analytical mind processing the visual data before me. A silver floor lamp I had purchased for my reading nook was leaning against the wall, its shade dented. A tangle of expensive computer cables and a cracked external monitor sat precariously on top of a crushed box containing my winter coats. They had not packed my belongings. They had completely purged my existence. They had swept through my carefully curated sanctuary and shoveled my life into garbage bags with the reckless disregard of looters. I stepped over a scattered pile of my own shoes and reached for the door handle. I slid my key into the deadbolt. It did not go in. I looked closely at the lock mechanism. The entire cylinder had been replaced. The familiar brushed steel lock I had used for years was gone, replaced by a cheap, shiny brass fixture that looked completely out of place against the heavy oak door. Before I could process the sheer illegality of an unauthorized lock change, the door suddenly swung inward. A loud, booming voice echoed from inside my living room. Trey was standing in the middle of my apartment barking orders. He was directing two exhausted-looking movers who were struggling to maneuver a massive, obnoxious emerald green velvet sofa through my entryway. The piece of furniture was an absolute monstrosity of bad taste, completely clashing with the sleek, modern aesthetic I had built. Trey was clapping his hands together, yelling tech startup jargon at the blue-collar workers, telling them to pivot the asset and optimize their leverage as if he were managing a corporate restructuring instead of moving a tacky couch. I stood motionless in the hallway, taking in the absolute destruction of my home. My custom shelving units had been ripped from the walls. My original artwork had been pulled down and stacked carelessly near the trash bags. Trey was strutting across my hardwood floors, acting as if he had just conquered a new territory. He had the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had finally secured the luxury lifestyle he so desperately craved, without ever having to work for it. Then Chelsea stepped into the doorframe, blocking my path. My younger sister was holding a plastic cup of iced matcha, casually swirling the green liquid around with a plastic straw. She looked me up and down with a lazy, triumphant smirk. She did not look guilty. She did not look conflicted. She looked entirely thrilled to be looking down at me from inside my own home. But it was not her smug expression that made my blood run cold. It was what she was wearing around her neck. Resting against her collarbone, gleaming under the harsh hallway lighting, was a heavy vintage gold chain. It was a distinctive braided rope design, a custom piece of jewelry that had belonged to our late father. It was the one physical item I cherished above all others. I kept it safely stored in a velvet box inside my bedroom nightstand. It was not just a piece of metal. It was a tangible connection to the only parent who had ever truly loved and respected me. Chelsea had not just broken into my apartment and thrown my clothes into the trash. She had gone straight into my bedroom, rummaged through my most intimate personal spaces, found my most prized possession, and fastened it around her own neck just to parade it in front of me. It was a calculated psychological strike. She wanted to wear my father's memory like a cheap accessory, just to prove she could take whatever she wanted from me. I stared at the gold chain. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my facial expression completely frozen. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I refused to let her see the emotional impact of her theft. I treated her exactly like a hostile variable in a complex dataset. Trey noticed me standing in the hallway. He paused his ridiculous micromanaging of the moving crew and sauntered over to stand behind his wife. He placed a possessive hand on Chelsea's shoulder. and looked at me with an incredibly punchable grin. He told me that I was blocking the logistics pathway and that I needed to step aside so they could finish onboarding their new furniture. He spoke to me as if I was a dismissed employee, lingering awkwardly in the lobby after being fired. Chelsea took a slow, loud sip of her iced drink. She leaned against the door jamb, intentionally adjusting her posture so the gold necklace caught the light. She looked at the trash bags surrounding my feet and offered a fake pout. She told me that she and Trey were officially moving in today. She said they needed a space that better reflected Trey's status as a rising CEO, and my apartment was simply sitting here going to waste. She adjusted the heavy gold chain around her neck, ensuring I was looking right at it. She smiled, showing all her teeth, and told me that her mother had given them full authorization to claim the property. They stood there in the doorway of my home, draped in my stolen heirlooms, ordering movers to replace my life with their garbage. They expected me to scream. They expected me to demand entry, to cry over the trash bags, to threaten them with the police. They wanted a chaotic, emotional meltdown that would validate their belief that I was unstable and desperate. I did not give them a single reaction. I simply recorded their faces with my eyes locked away the visual data and prepared to dismantle their entire fraudulent existence. Chelsea took another loud sip of her iced matcha drink. She leaned heavily against the doorframe and smiled with absolute malicious delight. She told me that Mom was furious about my little stunt this morning. She used the word insubordination. She actually said that because of my insubordination regarding the startup funding, Mom decided it was time for immediate consequences. Chelsea waved her free hand around my living room, gesturing toward the chaotic scene inside. She announced that since Mom was technically listed on the deed to this apartment, Mom had the supreme legal authority to grant them immediate residency. She told me I was officially evicted, effective immediately. She suggested I take my trash bags and find a cheap motel before the sun went down. I kept my eyes locked on hers. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a prosecutor laying out a timeline for a jury. I told Chelsea she was operating on a severe misunderstanding of property law and basic financial history. I reminded her exactly how this apartment was purchased. I laid out the raw data. 12 years ago, when I was 20 years old, my trust fund generated a massive dividend yield. I used that exact yield to purchase this property in cash. I paid for the inspection, the closing costs, the property taxes, and every single utility bill for the past decade. Lydia did not contribute a single cent to the purchase price. She merely manipulated the paperwork at the closing table, convincing a naive 20-year-old that having a parent on a joint deed would build my credit score. It was a calculated real estate trap designed to keep me perpetually under her thumb. The money was 100% mine, but she had weaponized a technicality. Chelsea rolled her eyes, dismissing the facts. She stated that the origin of the money did not matter in the real world. She claimed that a name on a deed is a name on a deed, and Mom gave them the keys, so the property was theirs now. Trey decided to insert himself back into the conversation. He clearly wanted to assert his dominance in front of his wife and the moving crew. He walked over to a stack of my personal belongings, resting precariously near the entryway. He picked up a small wooden box holding my collection of antique watches. He smirked at me and tossed the box carelessly out into the hallway. The wood splintered violently against the tile floor. The glass faces of two vintage watches shattered instantly, scattering sharp fragments across the corridor. He told me to stop whining and accept reality. He said they were doing me a massive favor by boxing up my junk. He claimed this apartment was now the official headquarters for his startup, and he needed the negative energy cleared out so his development team could focus on their upcoming launch. I looked at the shattered glass on the floor. I looked at the vintage gold necklace hanging around Chelsea's neck. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream at them to stop. Emotional outbursts are completely useless against narcissists. They feed on distress. If I cried, they would feel victorious. If I yelled, they would record me and frame me as the unstable sister throwing a pathetic tantrum over a misunderstanding. Instead, I reached into my tailored blazer pocket. I pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the lock screen, opened the camera application, and switched directly to video mode. I pressed the red record button and raised the lens to eye level. I framed the shot perfectly. I captured the broken wooden box on the floor. I panned up to capture Trey standing aggressively in my entryway. I panned over to Chelsea wearing my stolen family jewelry. I made sure to capture the unfamiliar locksmith hardware installed on the front door and the movers carrying the emerald green sofa into my private living space. I spoke clearly and distinctly over the recording. I stated my full name, the exact date, and the current time. I stated the legal address of my apartment. I narrated the visual evidence with total clinical detachment. I documented on video that Trey and Chelsea had engaged in an illegal self-help eviction without providing a 30-day written notice, without a formal court order, and without any legitimate legal standing. I documented the malicious destruction of my personal property, citing the shattered watchbox on the floor. I explicitly noted the stolen gold necklace currently residing on Chelsea's person. Trey's arrogant grin faltered immediately. His eyes darted nervously to the recording light on my phone. The confident tech CEO persona cracked under the pressure of actual unassailable data capture. He pointed a finger at me and demanded I stop recording. He took a heavy step forward, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me into lowering the device. He yelled that I was violating their privacy in their new home. I did not step back. I kept the camera perfectly steady on his face, capturing his aggressive posture and his threatening tone. I calmly informed him that there is absolutely no expectation of privacy in a common residential hallway, and that he had just committed felony destruction of property on camera. I reminded him that illegal eviction carries severe financial penalties in our jurisdiction, including treble damages for all destroyed items. Chelsea scoffed loudly, but she nervously touched the gold necklace, stepping slightly behind the doorframe to hide from the camera lens. She yelled that I was being ridiculous and that Mom would handle any legal issues I tried to cause. She told me to turn off the phone and leave before Trey called the police to remove me for trespassing. I told them I highly encouraged them to call the police. I said the authorities would be absolutely fascinated to see a grown man throwing a woman's possessions into a public corridor without a warrant. I hit the stop button on my recording. The high-definition video file saved directly to a secure remote cloud server, backing up instantly. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I crouched down with absolute composure. I carefully picked up the splintered wooden box containing my broken watches. I picked up the split cardboard box holding my father's old books. I did not touch the heavy trash bags filled with my clothes. Fabric can be easily replaced. Digital and physical evidence is invaluable. I stood back up and looked at the two intruders occupying my home. They looked remarkably less confident than they had 5 minutes ago. The reality of my total lack of emotion was beginning to deeply unsettle them. They had expected an easy victim to bully. They had encountered a highly efficient machine. I told Trey to enjoy the green velvet sofa while he still could. I told Chelsea to keep the gold necklace safe because she would be handing it directly to a judge very soon. I turned my back on them. I did not look back as I walked down the long carpeted hallway, carrying the physical evidence of their crimes. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I was not going to a cheap motel or a friend's house. I was going directly to the high-rise office of my trust lawyer, Harrison. The time for defensive maneuvers was officially over. It was time to initiate a complete legal annihilation. I left Harrison's office well past midnight, having set a massive legal machine into motion. I checked into a highly secure corporate hotel downtown, using my company card, ensuring my location was entirely untraceable by my family. I slept for exactly 5 hours. My mind was too disciplined to waste energy on tossing and turning. I needed to be razor sharp. The following morning, I walked into my company headquarters wearing a pristine, tailored suit, carrying my usual black coffee. Today was supposed to be a milestone. I was officially on the final shortlist for a promotion to senior product manager. It was a role that came with a significant bump in equity and authority. I walked onto the data analytics floor, ready to finalize my launch presentation. Before I could even log into my workstation, the head of human resources approached my desk. Director Bradley stood with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His expression was incredibly grave, devoid of the usual morning pleasantries. He asked me to follow him to the executive conference room immediately. He stated that it was an urgent compliance matter. In the corporate health tech sector, the word compliance is a loaded gun. It signifies severe breaches in protocol data security or financial integrity. I followed him down the glass-walled corridor, feeling a sudden, imperceptible shift in the office atmosphere. Colleagues who normally greeted me kept their heads down. The environment was highly sanitized, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. We entered the conference room. The chief compliance officer, a sharp woman named Diane, was already seated at the polished mahogany table. Between them rested a thick manila folder. They did not offer me coffee. They did not engage in small talk. Director Bradley gestured for me to sit down across from them. He folded his hands on the table and informed me that the company had received a highly detailed anonymous whistleblower report late last night. He opened the manila folder and slid a stack of printed documents toward me. He explained with a heavy voice that the anonymous tip accused me of severe corporate embezzlement. The complaint alleged that I had been exploiting my high-level security clearance to redirect vendor payments into offshore shell accounts. Furthermore, the report included aggressive claims of elder financial abuse, stating that I was currently under investigation for stealing millions of dollars from my own mother to fund a lavish secret lifestyle. They were accusing me of being a white-collar criminal hiding behind a corporate badge. The stakes were immediately clear. If these allegations were even partially entertained, I would not just lose my pending promotion to senior product manager. I would be instantly terminated, blacklisted from the entire tech industry, and potentially handed over to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. I looked down at the printed papers. I did not gasp. I did not clutch my pearls or burst into defensive tears. I activated my analytical protocols and examined the documents with the same intense scrutiny I applied to raw datasets. The first page was a printed email filled with inflammatory, highly emotional language. It used words like malicious, manipulative, and deceptive. It was the unmistakable theatrical phrasing of my mother, Lydia. She had always relied on dramatic adjectives when facts failed her. The subsequent pages were fake bank ledgers and fabricated vendor invoices. They were heavily redacted and plastered with official-looking logos. But the formatting was entirely wrong. The margins were inconsistent, and the financial terminology used in the fake invoices read exactly like a failing startup founder trying to sound intelligent. Trey had clearly generated these documents. My inner monologue rapidly decoded their entire strategy. It was actually a brilliantly malicious move. Lydia and Trey had realized last night that the $1.5 million trust fund was legally impenetrable. I had locked them out of the vault. Since they could not extract the money through direct intimidation, they had immediately pivoted to a scorched earth campaign against my livelihood. They knew my corporate job was my primary source of independent wealth and health insurance. Their objective was obvious. They wanted to nuke my career completely. They wanted me fired, disgraced, and stripped of my six-figure salary. They calculated that if they destroyed my independent income, I would become desperate. They assumed that a sudden lack of cash flow and the looming threat of industry blacklisting would force me to break the irrevocable trust just to survive their legal assault. They were trying to starve me out to force a surrender. Director Bradley watched my face closely, waiting for my reaction. He stated that given my impeccable employment record, they were conducting an internal review before involving external authorities. However, he noted that the documentation provided in the anonymous tip was incredibly concerning. Diane added that due to the sensitive nature of our health tech data, any employee facing credible embezzlement allegations must be immediately suspended, pending a full investigation. A suspension would be the first domino to fall. It would signal to the entire executive board that I was a liability, effectively killing my promotion and poisoning my professional reputation permanently. Lydia and Trey had orchestrated a precise character assassination designed to execute me in the corporate square. They expected me to panic. They expected me to stammer and plead for my job. They banked on the assumption that the sheer weight of a corporate compliance investigation would crush my resolve. They thought I would crumble under the accusation, just as I had crumbled under their emotional abuse when I was younger. I picked up the forged bank ledger and held it up to the fluorescent light of the conference room. I noted the specific pixelation around the corporate logos, indicating a low-quality copy and paste job. I placed the paper back on the mahogany table, aligning it perfectly parallel with the edge. I looked Director Bradley directly in the eyes. My pulse was entirely steady. I did not launch into a passionate defense of my character. I did not waste time explaining my toxic family dynamics to a corporate compliance officer who only cared about mitigating liability. I simply stated that the documents were blatant, malicious forgeries. I informed them that the allegations were part of a coordinated extortion attempt by estranged family members who were currently facing their own legal consequences for unauthorized property seizure. Diane leaned forward, her expression skeptical. She stated that while she appreciated my explanation, the company policy required them to operate based on the provided evidence. She said they could not simply ignore bank records and vendor invoices just because I claimed they were fake. I smiled, a very small, razor-sharp smile. I agreed with her completely. I told her that evidence is everything in data analysis. I pointed out that analyzing printed screenshots of digital documents is a fundamentally flawed methodology. I instructed Director Bradley to open his laptop and pull up the original anonymous email they had received. I did not ask for a delay. I did not ask for a lawyer. I demanded direct access to the source code of their sabotage. Director Bradley hesitated. His hand hovered over his corporate-issued laptop. He looked at Diane, seeking silent authorization to share confidential whistleblower data with the accused. Diane gave a slow, hesitant nod. In her eyes, I saw the first flicker of doubt. She was a compliance officer accustomed to guilty employees sweating, denying, and begging for mercy. She was not accustomed to an employee demanding to dissect the digital anatomy of their own execution order. Bradley turned the laptop screen toward me and pushed the device across the polished mahogany table. I did not touch the mouse right away. I instructed him to open the original raw email file, including the full internet headers. Bradley complied, clicking through the administrative portal until the screen displayed blocks of dense, monochromatic text. I pulled the laptop closer. The bright glow of the screen reflected in the dark conference room. I felt the familiar, comforting surge of adrenaline that always accompanied raw data analysis. The human element of this betrayal was messy and unpredictable, but code was absolute. Code did not lie. Code did not manipulate. I cracked my knuckles and placed my hands on the keyboard. I was no longer a daughter defending herself against a malicious family. I was a lead data analyst dismantling a poorly constructed firewall. I began typing rapidly, executing a series of command line prompts to bypass the basic email client interface. I explained every single keystroke to Bradley and Diane, keeping my voice at a steady instructional volume. I told them that an email is not just a digital letter. It is a highly complex package of data containing a precise geographic and temporal roadmap of its entire journey across the internet. I pointed to the first block of text, identifying the sending server. I explained that whoever orchestrated this sabotage had attempted to mask their location using a commercial virtual private network. They wanted it to look like the email originated from a secure offshore server, perfectly aligning with their fabricated story about me hiding money in foreign accounts. It was a cute attempt at digital espionage, but it was fundamentally flawed. Trey had built his tech startup on flashy marketing and outsourced code. He lacked the actual technical discipline required to execute a flawless digital assassination. He assumed a basic encryption tunnel would hide his tracks from a corporate security grid. I highlighted a specific string of characters buried deep within the routing path. I informed Diane that when you use a cheap commercial routing service, the original originating Internet Protocol address often leaks through the initial handshake protocol. I ran a reverse domain name system lookup right there in the conference room. The terminal window flashed as it queried the global database. I commanded the system to trace the leaked Internet Protocol address back to its physical point of origin. Bradley leaned in closer, his eyes darting across the scrolling lines of code. Diane sat perfectly still, her pen hovering above her notepad. The search completed with a sharp, definitive chime. A block of registration data populated the screen. I did not say a word. I simply turned the laptop back toward the center of the table, allowing the HR executives to read the raw data for themselves. The registered owner of the originating Internet Protocol address was not a disgruntled vendor or an offshore bank. It was a registered corporate entity located right here in Chicago. The screen clearly displayed the company name Aura Health Innovations. It was Trey's failing startup. Furthermore, the digital signature on the attached portable document format files, the fake invoices, and bank ledgers match the exact software licensing key registered to that same corporate entity. Trey had not even bothered to scrub the author metadata from the Properties tab of the forged documents before attaching them to his anonymous email. The silence in the executive conference room was absolute. The thick, suffocating tension that had greeted me 20 minutes ago evaporated completely, replaced by a stunned, heavy realization. Director Bradley stared at the screen, his mouth slightly ajar as he processed the irrefutable digital footprint proving my innocence. Diane carefully placed her pen down on the mahogany table. The compliance officer suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable, realizing she had nearly initiated a catastrophic termination based on the amateurish fabrications of my vindictive brother-in-law. The narrative had completely flipped. I was no longer the accused white-collar criminal. I was the victim of a targeted, malicious corporate sabotage. I kept my posture perfectly rigid. I asked Diane if she required any further clarification regarding the geographical origin of the anonymous complaint. I asked Bradley if he still believed the low-resolution vendor invoices warranted a suspension of my employment. Bradley cleared his throat, his professional demeanor scrambling to recover its footing. He pushed the manila folder containing the printed forgeries away from him as if it were suddenly toxic. He apologized immediately. He stated that the company was legally obligated to follow up on any financial whistleblowing, but he admitted that the digital evidence I had just extracted definitively exonerated me of all allegations. He assured me that my suspension was instantly voided and that my promotion trajectory to senior product manager remained entirely intact. Diane leaned forward, her expression shifting from skepticism to fierce corporate protectiveness. She informed me that launching a coordinated cyber attack against a key employee using falsified financial documents was a severe legal matter. She stated that the Human Resources Department would not simply sweep this under the rug. She offered to immediately engage our corporate legal team to pursue aggressive action against Aura Health Innovations for defamation, corporate interference, and digital harassment. She wanted to unleash the full weight of our billion-dollar legal department on Trey's fragile startup. It was a tempting offer. Watching my company lawyers dismantle Trey's business would have been incredibly satisfying. But I had a much larger, much more devastating strategy already in motion. Handing this over to corporate HR would only result in cease and desist letters and civil lawsuits. I needed absolute annihilation. I thanked Diane for her support and her offer of corporate legal muscle. I told her that I was currently working with my personal trust attorney to handle the familial aspects of this extortion attempt. I requested that HR formally document the malicious origin of the emails and close their internal investigation immediately. I wanted the incident officially stamped as a confirmed hoax to permanently insulate my professional record. Bradley agreed without a second of hesitation, promising to seal the file personally. I stood up from the conference table. I retrieved my black coffee, which had gone completely cold during the meeting. I walked out of the Human Resources Department with my career completely secure. Lydia and Trey had fired their biggest weapon at my livelihood, and I had effortlessly deflected it right back into their faces. They thought they were playing a game of emotional manipulation, but they had unknowingly entered a war of raw data and federal liabilities. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket as I stepped into the elevator. It was time to trigger the forensic audit. The transit from my corporate headquarters to Harrison's downtown law firm took exactly 14 minutes. I spent the entire cab ride categorizing the morning's events into actionable data sets. The human resources crisis was neutralized. Now it was time to address the tangible theft and the property invasion. I walked into the sweeping glass and marble lobby of Harrison's firm. The environment here was fundamentally different from my tech office. There were no casual seating areas or bright motivational posters. This imposing space was specifically designed to project absolute, unyielding power. The sharply dressed receptionist recognized me immediately and quickly escorted me straight back to the corner suite. Harrison was already standing by his conference table when I entered. He was a sharp, immaculately tailored attorney who moved with the precise energy of a man who billed by the minute and never lost a case. He took one look at my perfectly calm demeanor and gestured toward a leather chair. I sat down, placing my leather satchel on the polished mahogany surface. I did not waste his billable time with emotional venting. I opened my bag and extracted the printed screenshots of my banking application, along with the digital file transfer confirmation. I slid the paperwork across the table. I informed Harrison that at approximately 8 in the morning, Lydia had accessed a dormant joint checking account from my college years and initiated an unauthorized wire transfer of $12,000. I pointed to the specific transaction memo where my mother had explicitly written that the funds were back pay for raising me. Harrison adjusted his glasses and stared at the printout. A tight, humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth. He stated that taking money from a joint account is technically a gray area in civil court, but attaching a written confession of retaliatory extortion transforms it into a highly actionable offense. I instructed him to file a formal report with the bank's federal fraud department. I wanted her account flagged, her assets frozen, and an official investigation opened into unauthorized wire transfers. Harrison nodded, jotting down the routing numbers with swift strokes of his pen. Next, I pulled my smartphone from my blazer pocket. I unlocked the screen and opened the high-definition video file I had recorded in my apartment hallway just a few hours prior. I placed the phone in the center of the table and pressed play. Harrison watched in absolute silence as the footage documented the 15 contractor trash bags, my broken watch box, the changed locks, and the unauthorized moving crew. He watched Trey bragging about turning my home into a startup headquarters. He watched Chelsea actively wearing my late father's vintage gold necklace, while verbally confirming that Lydia orchestrated the illegal eviction. When the video ended, Harrison leaned back in his leather chair. He let out a long, slow breath, clearly astounded by the sheer magnitude of their legal stupidity. He stated that engaging in a self-help eviction without a court order was a massive civil violation, but breaking and entering to seize a property deeded entirely with trust yields elevated the situation to a catastrophic legal blunder. I told him I wanted an ex parte emergency injunction filed immediately. I wanted a judge to order the immediate vacation of the premises, and I wanted a police escort to enforce the order. I demanded that Trey and Chelsea be legally barred from stepping foot within 500 feet of my residence. I also instructed Harrison to draft a formal demand letter for the immediate return of the gold necklace, or I would press felony grand larceny charges against my sister. Harrison began typing furiously on his laptop, formulating the injunction paperwork. Then I reached into my satchel one final time. I pulled out a blank legal authorization form I had asked his paralegal to print before my arrival. I placed it flat on the mahogany table. I looked at Harrison and told him it was time to execute the final protocol. We had insulated the $1.5 million principal, but I needed to know exactly what Lydia had been doing in the shadows for the past decade. I looked him dead in the eyes and officially authorized a comprehensive 10-year forensic audit of Lydia's financial management. I wanted every single bank statement, tax return, wire transfer, and real estate holdings scrutinized by independent forensic accountants. I wanted them to trace every penny she had ever touched since my father died. Harrison stopped typing. He closed his laptop and looked at me with an incredibly grave expression. He warned me that initiating a forensic audit of this magnitude was the nuclear option. He explained that if the accountants found any evidence of commingling funds, unauthorized borrowing, or fiduciary negligence, the liability would not remain a private civil dispute. The findings would mandate reporting to federal tax authorities. He told me that once the audit started, there was no way to stop it. He warned me that launching this investigation meant declaring total, undeniable war against my own mother, and that it would likely end with her facing severe criminal prosecution. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to push the button. I did not blink. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. Lydia and Trey attempted to destroy my career, steal my home, and rob my emergency savings before lunch. They declared war the moment they handed me that fake document. I was returning fire with superior artillery. I picked up a pen from the center table. I told Harrison I did not care if the audit burned her entire life to the ground. I signed my full legal name on the authorization form, pressing the ink hard into the paper. I slid the executed document back across the polished mahogany table. I told him to authorize the independent accountants and completely tear her hidden financial history apart piece by piece. I stepped out of Harrison's office building and onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket to check my professional email, but my screen was already flooded with notifications. They were not from my corporate team. They were automated alerts I had set up months ago to monitor specific financial trends in the health tech sector. Today, those alerts were firing rapidly, all centered around a single entity: Aura Health Innovations. Trey had built his startup entirely on a foundation of aggressive marketing and hollow promises. He relied on keeping up appearances to secure rolling bridge loans from increasingly questionable private investors. But the tech industry is a brutal ecosystem that eventually demands raw, verifiable data. The news was breaking across several minor tech blogs and social media platforms. Aura Health Innovations had missed a critical payroll cycle. A group of their outsourced developers had gone public with accusations of unpaid contracts. Key executives were scrubbing the company name from their professional profiles. The digital implosion was happening in real time. Without the $500,000 bailout he had tried to extort from me this morning, Trey had hit the absolute end of his financial runway. His house of cards was collapsing, and the debris was raining down on his perfectly curated life. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. A continuous stream of text messages began pouring in from Chelsea. I stood on the corner of the busy intersection watching her incoming messages stack up on my illuminated screen. The progression of her texts was a fascinating case study in psychological desperation. The first few messages were dripping with her usual arrogant entitlement. She demanded to know why the local police had just showed up at my apartment with an emergency injunction. She ordered me to call the precinct and cancel the eviction immediately, complaining that the moving crew had left her new velvet sofa sitting abandoned on the sidewalk. She typed in all capital letters, threatening to have Lydia completely destroy my life for humiliating her in front of the building staff. I did not reply. I did not block her number. I needed to let her create a documented record of her own harassment. I simply watched the cursor bubble appear and disappear as she typed frantically. When 10 minutes passed without a response from me, her tone underwent a radical, violent shift. The aggressive demands morphed into a chaotic barrage of emotional manipulation. She sent a voice note crying hysterically about how Trey was locking himself in the bathroom and refusing to speak to her. She texted that angry investors were calling her personal cell phone demanding answers about their money. The pristine bubble of her unearned luxury had burst, and she was suddenly drowning in the terrifying reality of accountability. Then came the predictable pivot. Chelsea realized anger and threats were entirely ineffective against a wall of silence. She seamlessly transitioned into her final defense mechanism. She attempted to weaponize our childhood. She sent a massive paragraph recalling a summer vacation when we were teenagers. She reminded me of a time I had covered for her when she crashed a borrowed jet ski, taking the blame so Lydia would not ground her. She typed that we were sisters, and that sisters are supposed to protect each other from the harsh realities of the world. She begged me to remember how much she loved me, pleading with me to sign a release for the trust funds to save her marriage and her reputation. She promised that if I just gave them the cash infusion, things would go back to normal and we could finally be a real united family again. She even promised to return my father's vintage gold necklace, as if my own stolen property was a generous bargaining chip. I read her desperate nostalgic pleas with absolute clinical detachment. Her messages were textbook manipulation. This is exactly what happens when a golden child is suddenly stripped of their enablers and forced to confront the harsh, unyielding consequences of the real world. For 27 years, Chelsea had existed in a carefully constructed alternate reality where every mistake was magically erased by our mother. She had never been required to develop resilience, personal accountability, or basic problem-solving skills. Lydia had severely handicapped my sister by shielding her from every single negative outcome. Now facing a catastrophic financial and legal crisis, Chelsea lacked the psychological software required to process the incoming data. She was panicking. When a golden child realizes their primary enabler can no longer bend reality to protect them, they instinctively search for a new host. Chelsea was not bringing up childhood memories because she suddenly valued our sisterhood. She was invoking nostalgia to trigger my deeply ingrained habit of sacrificing myself for her comfort. She wanted me to step into Lydia's role and become her new financial shield. She expected me to absorb her consequences. I analyzed the text messages, observing how her panic translated into messy grammatical errors and disjointed sentences. The golden child was entirely unequipped to navigate a situation where her tears did not instantly produce a monetary reward. I deleted the audio voice note without listening to the end. I did not type back a single word to offer comfort or clarification. Giving her any form of response, even a negative one, would only provide her with the emotional fuel she needed to continue the engagement. I locked my screen, slid the phone back into my pocket, and hailed a passing cab to return to my secure corporate hotel. I settled into the quiet cab. The data was clear. Their operation was failing. The collapse had officially begun, and I was going to let gravity do the rest. I looked out the window, watching the city lights blur into a glowing streak. The secure corporate hotel offered a sterile but necessary refuge from the chaos my family had orchestrated. I walked into my suite, placed my leather satchel on the glass desk, and immediately began organizing my notes. The silence of the room was broken by the sharp, harsh ringing of my smartphone. I glanced at the illuminated screen, expecting another automated alert about Trey's failing company. Instead, the caller identification displayed Chelsea's name. She was calling me directly. I knew engaging with her was statistically likely to result in another barrage of manipulation, but my analytical mind recognized an opportunity to gather critical intelligence. I needed to know exactly how rapidly their situation was deteriorating to properly prepare my legal defenses. I swiped the screen to accept the call and pressed the phone against my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited. The sound that came through the receiver was jarring. It was not the high-pitched theatrical whining Chelsea typically used to get her way. It was a raw, visceral sobbing. She was hyperventilating, gasping for oxygen between ragged, wet breaths. The pristine, polished golden child was completely unraveling. I listened to the chaotic sounds of her panic, maintaining my absolute emotional detachment. When she finally managed to form a coherent sentence, her voice was trembling so violently I could barely understand her. She begged me not to hang up. She said she had nowhere else to turn, and that Lydia was currently unresponsive, staring blankly at a wall in their suburban house. Chelsea was entirely alone with a catastrophe she could not comprehend. I instructed her to regulate her breathing and state the facts of the situation clearly. My clinical tone seemed to act as a tether, grounding her escalating hysteria, just enough to extract the necessary data. Chelsea choked back a sob and delivered a confession that fundamentally altered the parameters of their financial crisis. She admitted that Trey's venture capital investors were not actually legitimate technology investors. They were not corporate entities sitting in sleek boardrooms reviewing pitch decks. They were dangerous, unregulated private lenders operating entirely outside the boundaries of the traditional financial system. Trey had exhausted his legitimate borrowing capacity years ago. To maintain his flashy CEO persona and fund their extravagant lifestyle, he had turned to individuals who do not send polite collection letters when a payment is missed. Chelsea confessed the entire operation was a complete sham. Trey's highly publicized health tech startup had generated absolutely zero revenue. He had been running a classic Ponzi scheme. He used the cash infusions from new predatory lenders to pay the exorbitant interest rates demanded by the old lenders. He shuffled stolen money between hidden accounts to project an illusion of aggressive corporate growth. But the music had finally stopped. The influx of new capital had dried up, and the older lenders were demanding their principal balances immediately. Chelsea cried that Trey owed millions of dollars, and these people were currently calling his personal cell phone, threatening severe physical violence. She screamed into the phone that the $500,000 they demanded from me this morning was never meant for software development. It was a desperate bridge payment intended to pacify the most violent lender in Trey's network. Chelsea begged me to undo the irrevocable trust. She pleaded with me to call Harrison and release the funds, claiming that Trey's actual life was in immediate danger. She attempted to place the burden of his survival entirely on my shoulders. She cried that if I withheld my inheritance, I would be personally signing her husband's death warrant and destroying her family forever. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my hotel suite, looking out over the sprawling grid of downtown Chicago. I processed her confession with the cold, calculated precision of a risk assessment algorithm. The sheer magnitude of Trey's financial recklessness was astounding. He had not just failed at business, he had actively engaged in massive criminal fraud and intentionally entangled himself with a violent criminal element. Now Chelsea expected me to liquidate my safely guarded assets and hand them over to a syndicate of loan sharks to mask her husband's felonies. I broke down the financial mechanics of her request aloud. I spoke to my sister not as a sibling, but as a forensic data analyst dissecting a fatal error. I explained that paying $500,000 to unregulated criminals would not solve Trey's systemic debt crisis. It would simply signal to the lenders that he possessed a wealthy, vulnerable family member willing to act as an endless financial reservoir. If I paid them today, they would return next month demanding double the amount. Furthermore, transferring funds from my legally scrutinized trust account directly into a fraudulent Ponzi scheme would instantly make me a financial accessory to his federal crimes. I would be willingly integrating my clean assets into a toxic criminal ledger. It was a black hole, and I absolutely refused to be pulled over the event horizon. Chelsea wailed loudly through the speaker, her desperation turning into a frenzied panic. She asked me how I could be so incredibly heartless. She demanded to know what she was supposed to do right now with men threatening to show up at her front door. She expected me to swoop in and offer a magical solution to rescue her from the consequences of her own blinding ignorance. I delivered my final absolute boundary. I told Chelsea that she had exactly two rational options. She could either pack a single bag, leave her apartment immediately, and check into a secure hotel under an assumed name, or she could march straight to the nearest police precinct and hand Trey over to the federal authorities. I informed her that those were the only statistically viable methods to ensure her physical safety. I stated with unwavering finality that I would not, under any circumstances, utilize a single penny of my inheritance to subsidize a criminal enterprise. I told her that she and Trey had built a house on a foundation of lies, and they were now required to sit inside it while it burned to the ground. She began to scream my name, begging me to reconsider, but I pulled the phone away from my ear. I tapped the red button, disconnecting the call instantly. I immediately navigated to her contact profile and blocked her number permanently. I had extracted the necessary data regarding the severity of their collapse. Engaging further provided zero strategic value. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk, perfectly content to let the consequences of their actions consume them entirely. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk, perfectly content to let the consequences of their actions consume them entirely. The remainder of the night passed in absolute silence. I woke up at exactly 5 in the morning, my internal biological clock functioning with its usual flawless precision. I completed my morning routine, ordered a black coffee from room service, and opened my laptop to review the overnight data processing logs for my company. At precisely 6:45, my encrypted email client chimed with a high-priority notification. The sender was Harrison. The subject line contained a single capitalized word: urgent. I opened the message. Harrison instructed me to come to his office immediately. He stated that the forensic accounting team had worked continuously through the night to expedite the financial background check. The preliminary audit results were compiled, and he needed to brief me in person before the markets opened. I arrived at his high-rise office building 30 minutes later. The sprawling lobby was practically empty at this hour, devoid of the usual corporate foot traffic. The receptionist immediately escorted me to the conference room. Harrison was already seated at the polished mahogany table. He looked remarkably different from our meeting the previous afternoon. His usual sharp, unyielding composure had been replaced by an expression of profound, grim realization. He had loosened his silk tie, and a half-empty cup of coffee sat next to a thick, heavy document folder with a stark red cover. I took the leather chair across from him and placed my hands flat on the table. I asked him to deliver the raw data. Harrison pushed the red folder across the mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of me. He explained that he had instructed his top forensic accountants to execute a deep dive into Lydia's financial ecosystem. They utilized aggressive tracing algorithms to map out every single bank account, tax filing, property deed, and credit line associated with her social security number over the past 10 years. Harrison leaned forward, folding his hands together. He told me that the results were absolutely catastrophic. He stated that the immaculate, wealthy country club lifestyle my mother had projected for the past decade was nothing more than a highly leveraged financial mirage. The raw numbers painted a picture of staggering insolvency. Lydia had zero liquid assets. Her personal investment portfolios had been drained years ago. She had taken out massive predatory loans against her luxury vehicles and quietly remortgaged her suburban home to the absolute maximum legal limit. I opened the red folder and began scanning the spreadsheets. My eyes darted across the columns of red ink and negative balances. As a data analyst, I recognized the pattern immediately. This was a classic downward spiral of debt restructuring. Lydia had been borrowing from new creditors simply to pay the minimum interest balances on her older loans. She was operating her own personal Ponzi scheme long before she ever met Trey. The impeccable matriarch who constantly belittled my career and mocked my financial independence was actually drowning in millions of dollars of toxic consumer debt. But the audit revealed something far more sinister than simple financial mismanagement. Harrison tapped a specific page in the middle of the dossier. He instructed me to look at the money flowing between Lydia's accounts and Trey's failing startup. I traced the digital breadcrumbs. The data showed a massive, complex web of interrelated transactions. Lydia was not just an innocent mother-in-law who had been manipulated by a charismatic tech founder. The ledgers proved she was a willing and desperate participant in his fraudulent ecosystem. Harrison explained the grim reality of the situation. He stated that when Trey initially launched his fake health tech company, Lydia saw an opportunity to manufacture a sudden influx of cash. She had utilized her extensive country club network to recruit initial seed investors for Trey. She leveraged her fake wealth and social standing to convince other affluent families to pour money into his non-existent software. In exchange, Trey had been secretly kicking back a massive percentage of those invested funds directly into Lydia's personal accounts, under the guise of consulting fees. They were running a coordinated two-person extortion ring. I stared at the financial mapping, completely understanding the architecture of their crime. They had created a symbiotic parasite. Trey provided the flashy corporate vehicle, and Lydia provided the wealthy, trusting victims. They fed off each other, sustaining their luxurious illusions with stolen capital. But the data clearly showed that the influx of new victims had completely dried up approximately 8 months ago. The consulting fee kickbacks to Lydia had abruptly stopped. Harrison pointed to the most recent transaction log. He noted that without that stolen income stream, Lydia's entire financial structure had entered immediate critical failure. She had defaulted on her massive mortgage. Her luxury cars were weeks away from repossession. Her creditors were actively preparing to file public lawsuits that would completely destroy her carefully guarded social reputation. She was standing on the precipice of total public humiliation and absolute bankruptcy. This revelation completely recontextualized the events of my 30th birthday. The aggressive ambush in my kitchen, the forged power of attorney document, and the demand for $500,000 were not just arrogant attempts to fund Trey's failing business. Lydia did not simply want my money to be a supportive mother to Chelsea or to help her son-in-law out of a tight spot. She was deeply personally desperate. She needed that exact sum of money to cover her own fraudulent tracks and stave off her own impending financial execution. I closed the red folder and looked at Harrison. I stated that her desperation made her dangerous, but it also made her predictable. She had treated my trust fund as her ultimate salvation. She had spent the last 10 years counting down the days until my 30th birthday, viewing my inheritance as her guaranteed bailout package. Harrison nodded solemnly. He agreed, but his expression remained tight and deeply concerned. He told me that the audit had uncovered one final transaction, a transaction so reckless and illegal that it elevated the entire situation from a severe civil dispute into a catastrophic federal nightmare. Harrison reached into the back pocket of the red audit folder and withdrew a thick stack of commercial banking contracts. He laid them flat on the polished mahogany table, carefully aligning the edges. He pointed to the top sheet bearing the distinct embossed logo of a major federally insured national bank. He explained that precisely 6 months ago, Trey had reached a critical inflection point. His unregulated private lenders were demanding immediate returns, and his Ponzi scheme was teetering on the edge of total exposure. Trey desperately needed a massive cash infusion to keep his fraudulent operation afloat. Lydia stepped in to secure a $1 million commercial loan to serve as a bridge payment. I stared at the financial paperwork in front of me. I asked Harrison a highly logical question. I demanded to know how a woman with maximized residential mortgages, defaulted vehicle loans, and absolutely zero liquid assets managed to qualify for a 7-figure commercial credit line at a Tier 1 federal institution. Harrison did not answer immediately. He simply slid the second page of the banking contract toward me and tapped his index finger against the collateralization clause. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, parsing the strict financial parameters. Right there in stark black ink, buried beneath pages of corporate jargon, was the specific routing and account number of my inheritance. Lydia had not just lied to her wealthy country club friends to secure seed money. She had actively and maliciously lied to a federal financial institution. She utilized her residual knowledge of my late father's estate planning and her lingering administrative access to my childhood banking profiles to present herself as the primary financial guarantor for the commercial loan. Harrison pointed to the signature line at the very bottom of the preliminary authorization forms. My full legal name was scrawled across the designated space in dark blue ink. It was a flawless, absolute forgery. Lydia had painstakingly practiced my signature, replicating the exact slant pressure and curvature of my handwriting. She explicitly pledged my soon-to-vest $1.5 million trust fund as the absolute collateral securing Trey's fraudulent commercial loan. She essentially mortgaged my entire future and leveraged my hard-earned financial security simply to buy her highly manipulative son-in-law another 6 months of fake corporate success. I analyzed the chronological timeline, connecting the disparate data points with ruthless efficiency. The bank had approved the preliminary loan underwriting based entirely on the forged collateral pledge. However, standard federal compliance regulations required the institution to conduct a final manual asset verification within 30 days of the designated trust vesting date. That specific compliance regulation was the missing piece of the puzzle. That was the exact reason why Lydia had ambushed me in my kitchen at the crack of dawn on my 30th birthday. The heavily stapled power of attorney document she tried to force me to sign over my morning coffee was not just a blunt tool to steal my money, it was a desperate retroactive shield. She urgently needed my legitimate physical signature to officially authorize the collateral pledge before the bank executed their final automated compliance audit. If I had signed that paper in a moment of familial weakness, I would have instantly legitimized her felony forgery. I would have permanently and legally shackled my entire net worth to Trey's imploding criminal enterprise. A cold, sharp wave of profound realization washed over me. By silently executing the transfer of my entire inheritance into an irrevocable trust, at the exact stroke of midnight, I had not merely protected my money from a greedy parent. I had accidentally detonated a massive financial bomb directly underneath Lydia's entire operation. When my funds moved into the impenetrable legal vault of the irrevocable trust, they completely vanished from the commercial banking grid. The underlying collateral securing the $1 million federal loan ceased to exist as an accessible financial asset. Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the conference table. He told me that the bank's automated risk management algorithms would inevitably flag the missing collateral within the next 48 hours. Once the corporate banking system registered a $1 million unsecured liability attached to a defaulting tech startup, the institution would initiate an immediate aggressive manual review of the entire loan file. Harrison broke down the severe implications under United States financial law. He spoke with the grim, absolute finality of a judge delivering a terminal sentence. He stated that forging a signature on a loan application submitted to a federally insured institution is a direct, blatant violation of strict federal statutes. Because the loan funds were subsequently distributed electronically across state lines using the automated clearinghouse network, it automatically triggered a highly severe secondary charge of wire fraud. This was no longer a petty civil dispute over family inheritance or a minor contractual disagreement. Submitting falsified collateral documents to a major financial entity constitutes federal bank fraud. Harrison explained that these specific charges carry catastrophic, unyielding penalties. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and federal banking regulators do not entertain tearful maternal apologies or domestic excuses regarding family loyalty. They operate entirely on documented evidence. They only see a $1 million federal crime executed with premeditated malice. Lydia and Trey were not just facing personal bankruptcy or the total destruction of their social reputation. They were actively staring down the barrel of 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The federal sentencing guidelines mandate severe minimum terms for this specific tier of financial deception, offering absolutely zero leniency for first-time offenders who conspire to defraud national banks. Their frantic, aggressive behavior in my apartment was completely stripped of its mystery. Their panic was not born out of a desire to build a business or secure a luxury vacation home in Aspen. Their sheer desperation to get me to sign the power of attorney was literally a matter of keeping themselves out of a federal prison cell. They were trapped in a burning building of their own creation, and my signature was the only viable fire exit. By refusing to hand over the pen, I had effectively sealed the doors and locked them inside. My analytical mind categorized their impending doom as a simple, inevitable output of their highly fraudulent inputs. The data simply demanded a total execution. I sat in the heavy silence of the conference room processing the absolute finality of the situation. Harrison watched me closely. He was a veteran attorney accustomed to clients reacting to federal crimes with tears, panic, or frantic negotiations. He expected me to ask if there was a way to save my mother from a federal penitentiary. He assumed the biological imperative of family loyalty would eventually override my analytical detachment. He was incorrect. I did not feel a single shred of sympathy. I felt the profound settling clarity that occurs when a complex mathematical theorem is finally proven. Lydia was not just a toxic parent clinging to her fabricated country club status. She was a desperate cornered criminal holding a lit match over a massive financial powder keg. Trey was not just an arrogant tech bro running a failing startup. He was an active co-conspirator in a federal wire fraud operation facing the total annihilation of his freedom. They were both staring directly into the abyss of the United States justice system. Harrison tapped a gold pen against his mahogany desk, breaking the silence. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. He stated that we could immediately hand the forensic audit over to the federal authorities and let the Federal Bureau of Investigation handle the arrests. He warned that taking that path would trigger an immediate media circus, freezing all assets and permanently branding my family name with federal indictments. I shook my head. I told him that handing the audit over right now was strategically premature. I explained my reasoning with cold precision. If we went to the authorities today, Lydia and Trey would immediately play the victims. They would hire expensive white-collar defense attorneys, using the last of their stolen credit lines to spin a highly polished narrative of a simple administrative misunderstanding. They would attempt to claim that the forged signature was just a minor clerical error, made in good faith by a caring mother trying to help her busy daughter manage complex financial investments. They would use their remaining country club connections and social capital to paint me as a vindictive, estranged child trying to ruin a minor oversight. I refused to leave them a single microscopic loophole to escape through. The federal justice system required undeniable malice to secure a maximum sentence, and I intended to provide them with an absolute mountain of it. I outlined the psychological profile of a trapped narcissist for my attorney. Lydia knew the bank would inevitably discover the missing collateral within a matter of days. She knew her forged signature was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate her entire life. She also knew that the only thing standing between her and a concrete federal prison cell was my retroactive authorization. She desperately needed me to sign a document validating the fraudulent pledge. She needed me to formally acknowledge the $1 million loan as a legitimate transaction approved by the trust beneficiary. I looked at Harrison and stated that I currently held the ultimate executioner's switch. They were going to come for me. They had to. Their basic survival depended entirely on forcing my compliance. They would not stop at changing the locks on my apartment or sending forged emails to my human resources department. Those were simply opening salvos. Now that their initial intimidation tactics had failed spectacularly, they would be forced to escalate their strategy. I predicted their next exact maneuver. I told Harrison they would realize that aggressive isolation tactics were completely ineffective against me. Therefore, they would pivot to a highly coordinated public performance. Lydia would attempt to trap me in a controlled social environment. She would try to leverage extended family members, deploying aunts and uncles as unwitting pawns to guilt me into submission. She would manufacture a scenario where refusing to sign her retroactive authorization would make me look like a monster destroying the family over petty financial grievances. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. He asked if I was fully prepared to walk into a trap like that, knowing exactly how desperate and dangerous they were. I replied that I was not just prepared to walk into their trap. I was going to actively help them spring it. I instructed Harrison to hold the forensic audit secure. I told him not to notify the bank or the federal authorities just yet. I wanted Lydia and Trey to feel the terrifying, suffocating pressure of the impending banking compliance deadline. I wanted them sweating, bleeding, and grasping at invisible straws. I wanted them to build their own gallows step by step and hand me the rope. I stood up from the conference table and smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. I felt an incredible surge of pure, unfiltered power. For 32 years, Lydia had controlled the narrative. She had dictated my worth, my value, and my place within the family hierarchy. She had treated me as a convenient financial resource, completely devoid of human agency. Now the entire structure of her existence rested squarely in the palm of my hand. I gathered my leather satchel and thanked Harrison for his exceptional work. I told him to keep his phone on and be ready to transmit the red folder to the Federal Risk Management Department the exact second I gave the signal. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back onto the bustling Chicago streets. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a calendar invitation sent directly from Lydia. The subject line read, "Family Reconciliation Dinner." The location was an upscale, incredibly public steakhouse downtown. The guest list included not only Trey and Chelsea, but also 3 of my most judgmental extended family members, The date was set for tomorrow evening. I stared at the digital invitation. My prediction had materialized with absolute algorithmic perfection. Lydia was setting the stage for her grand theatrical performance. She was preparing the ultimate social pressure cooker to extract the signature that would save her from federal prison. I tapped the screen and officially accepted the invitation. I was going to give her exactly the audience she desperately wanted. And then I was going to execute them all. The atmosphere of the downtown steakhouse was thick with the scent of seared meat and expensive bourbon. It was Friday evening at prime dining hour. The main dining room was packed with wealthy corporate clients celebrating weekly victories and affluent families displaying their social status. The lighting was deliberately dim, relying on heavy brass chandeliers and flickering table candles to create an aura of exclusive intimacy. I checked my tailored blazer in the reflection of the glass entrance doors before stepping onto the plush carpet. Lydia had strategically selected a large circular booth situated directly in the geographic center of the restaurant. It was a highly calculated environmental choice. She deliberately placed us in the most public visible location possible. She operated on the fundamental assumption that I possessed a desperate need to avoid public embarrassment. She believed the sheer volume of high society witnesses would force me into quiet, passive compliance. She fundamentally misunderstood my current operating parameters. I was not there to preserve social decorum. I was there to execute a demolition. I paused near the host stand, shielded by a large decorative indoor plant, to conduct a preliminary visual assessment of the targets. I needed to analyze their physical baseline before engaging. Lydia sat perfectly upright at the head of the table, wearing a pristine white silk blouse and an expression of manufactured serenity. She was drinking a glass of red wine, playing the role of the generous matriarch hosting a lavish family gathering. But the real raw data was sitting directly to her left. Trey and Chelsea were actively falling apart in real time. They looked like absolute catastrophic failures. Trey had completely lost his curated Silicon Valley visionary aesthetic. The arrogant swagger he displayed while invading my apartment just a few days ago had entirely evaporated. He wore a wrinkled charcoal blazer over a t-shirt that clung damply to his chest. Even in the dim lighting of the steakhouse, I could clearly see the heavy sheen of cold sweat coating his forehead. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to keep them pressed flat against the white tablecloth to hide the shaking. His right leg bounced up and down with a frantic, erratic rhythm, bumping the underside of the heavy wooden table. He kept darting his eyes toward the restaurant entrance and compulsively checking the illuminated screen of his smartphone. The violent, unregulated private lenders he had defrauded were clearly tightening the noose around his neck. The federal compliance deadline was counting down in his head with every single heartbeat. Chelsea looked equally decimated. The pampered golden child had been stripped of her glossy, unearned confidence. Her usually flawless blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She had attempted to conceal the dark, bruised-looking bags under her eyes with a heavy layer of foundation, but the sheer exhaustion bled right through the cosmetics. She looked like she had not slept a single minute since our phone call regarding the Ponzi scheme. Her skin was a sickly ashen color. She sat hunched forward, staring blankly at her empty water glass, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of her impending financial and legal ruin. Sitting across from the impending disaster were the social enforcers Lydia had activated. Aunt Brenda and Uncle Thomas were my mother's favorite pawns. They were wealthy, incredibly judgmental extended family members who thrived on maintaining the illusion of perfect family harmony. Lydia had clearly invited them to serve as the moral executioners for the evening. Their specific function was to apply overwhelming social pressure and guilt me into signing whatever documents Lydia presented. They had absolutely no idea that Trey was running a criminal syndicate or that Lydia had committed federal bank fraud. They simply believed the false narrative that I was acting like a greedy, difficult daughter, refusing to help my struggling sister over a petty misunderstanding. I stepped out from behind the decorative plant and walked directly toward the center booth. My posture was rigid, my expression completely locked. Lydia spotted me approaching and immediately stood up. She threw her arms wide open, putting on a sickeningly sweet display of maternal affection for the surrounding tables. She loudly exclaimed how thrilled she was that I had decided to join the family reconciliation dinner. I did not reciprocate the gesture. I smoothly sidestepped her extended arms, denying her the physical contact, and slid into the only empty leather chair at the far end of the booth. I placed my heavy leather satchel on the floor, pressing it firmly against my right calf. Inside that bag rested the red forensic audit folder. It was a loaded weapon waiting to be drawn. Aunt Brenda immediately launched into her assigned psychological manipulation script. She leaned over her plate of expensive appetizers and smiled at me with condescending pity. She told me that family is the most important asset a person can possess. She used heavily loaded terms like grace, forgiveness, and being the bigger person. She lectured me about how money should never be allowed to divide a loving household. She insisted that holding on to anger only poisons the soul, and that tonight was about wiping the slate clean for the good of everyone involved. I listened to her recite the toxic talking points without interrupting. I simply cataloged her words as irrelevant background noise. She was a faulty variable in an equation that had already been solved. Trey could barely contain his escalating panic while Aunt Brenda droned on about family unity. He picked up his water glass, attempting to take a sip, but his hand shook so badly, the ice clinked loudly against the crystal rim, spilling water onto the pristine tablecloth. He slammed the glass back down and shot a desperate, wide-eyed look of pure terror directly at Lydia. He was silently begging her to accelerate the timeline. Every second spent on small talk was another second the federal banking algorithms ticked closer to discovering their massive collateral fraud. Lydia caught his panic signal and immediately took control of the narrative. She poured me a glass of sparkling water and offered a bright artificial smile. She announced to the table that she wanted to formally and publicly apologize for the minor friction that had occurred over the past few days. She utilized aggressive semantic minimization, calling the illegal eviction and the attempted theft of $500,000 a simple miscommunication born out of misplaced protective instincts for Trey's business. She smoothly laid the foundational groundwork for her ultimate trap, operating under the fatal delusion that I was still a naive, susceptible child. Lydia reached for her napkin and pressed it delicately beneath her lower lashes. Right on cue, a single glistening tear escaped and rolled down her perfectly powdered cheek. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She lowered her voice to a fragile, trembling register, ensuring that the surrounding tables could catch the agonizing timbre of a heartbroken mother. She began a monologue about the sanctity of blood ties. She told Aunt Brenda and Uncle Thomas that the world is a cold, unforgiving place, and that family is the only true shield we possess against the darkness. She claimed that the recent stress had nearly broken her spirit, but it had also reminded her of what truly mattered. Her performance was terrifyingly convincing. If I had not spent the last decade building psychological firewalls against her specific brand of toxicity, I might have actually believed she was experiencing genuine remorse. I simply watched her calculating the precise amount of energy she was expending to generate those tears. It was an astonishing waste of cellular resources. Aunt Brenda immediately fell for the theatrical display. She reached across the white tablecloth and placed a comforting hand over Lydia's. Brenda shot me a severe, reprimanding glare, silently demanding that I absorb my mother's fabricated pain and offer immediate absolution. Uncle Thomas shifted his weight and cleared his throat, muttering gruffly about how life is too short to hold grudges over simple misunderstandings. Chelsea leaned her head against Trey's shoulder, adopting the posture of a frail, exhausted wife, simply desperate for peace. Trey, meanwhile, looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths, but he managed to force a stiff, unnatural smile. He nodded along with Lydia's monologue, playing the role of the humble, misunderstood son-in-law who only wanted to bring the family closer together. The entire physical space of the circular booth was engineered to compress me into submission. They were using the crushing weight of societal expectation to force my compliance. Just as Lydia reached the emotional crescendo of her speech, wiping away a fresh wave of manufactured tears, Trey gave a sharp, frantic nod toward the restaurant entrance. A man detached himself from the shadows near the bar and began walking briskly toward our table. I analyzed him instantly. He did not possess the sleek, expensive aura of a corporate attorney like Harrison. He wore a poorly tailored gray suit that bunched awkwardly at the shoulders. His tie was slightly crooked, and he carried a battered leather briefcase that had seen better days. He exuded the frantic, greasy energy of a strip mall defense lawyer who specialized in settling petty crimes before they hit a courtroom. He squeezed his way into the circular booth, sliding in right next to Trey. He smelled strongly of stale coffee and cheap peppermint cologne. Trey introduced him to the table as Mr. Gable, a close personal friend and independent legal consultant, who was just here to help facilitate the reconciliation process. Lydia smiled, wiping her eyes, and adopted a tone of bright, optimistic finality. She announced to Aunt Brenda and Uncle Thomas that to truly put this entire ugly misunderstanding behind us, we just needed to handle a tiny piece of administrative housekeeping. Mr. Gable snapped his briefcase open with loud metallic clicks that drew annoyed glances from the neighboring booth. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper and a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. He did not make eye contact with me. He was sweating almost as profusely as Trey. Gable slid the document across the pristine white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of my plate. He spoke in a rapid, hushed cadence, desperately trying to sound casually professional. He claimed it was a standard family asset release form. He stated it was just a simple boilerplate agreement to officially authorize the restructuring of some minor shared portfolios so everyone could walk away with a clean slate. I looked down at the single sheet of paper. The heading was deceptively simple, but my eyes instantly locked onto the dense alphanumeric codes buried in the third paragraph. I recognized the specific federal routing sequence. I recognized the internal institutional identifiers for the bank that held Trey's fraudulent commercial loan. The document Gable had just slid across the steakhouse table was not a peace offering. It was a retroactive signatory authorization. It was a highly specific legal instrument designed to explicitly ratify the $1 million collateral pledge Lydia had forged 6 months ago. They were attempting to trick me into legally admitting that I had willingly provided my trust fund to back Trey's loan from the very beginning. Aunt Brenda chimed in again, her voice dripping with sugary coercion. She urged me to just sign the paper so we could finally order our entrees and celebrate being a family again. Uncle Thomas tapped his watch, noting that the evening was getting late and we should wrap up this boring business talk. They were entirely clueless. They had absolutely no idea they were actively pressuring me into becoming a documented accessory to a massive federal banking crime. They thought they were mediating a petty family squabble over pride. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. The maternal tears had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare of absolute predatory demand. She pushed the plastic pen closer to my hand. Her voice dropped an octave, carrying a sharp, vibrating edge of sheer desperation. She told me to stop being difficult and just sign the form, Madeline. She promised that once the ink was dry, everything would go back to normal, and I would never have to worry about these financial stressors ever again. Trey let out a ragged breath, rubbing his hands together. He tried to project a calm, reassuring demeanor, but his voice cracked slightly. He promised me a significant return on my investment, emphasizing that this signature was just a temporary bridge to get his company over a minor compliance hurdle. Chelsea stared at the pen, her eyes wide and unblinking, practically vibrating with the need for me to comply. They had constructed the perfect social trap. If I refused, I would instantly be branded a monster in front of my extended family, making a scene in a high-end restaurant over a simple signature. But I saw the absolute terror radiating from the three of them. The air around the table felt incredibly thin, thick with the scent of their impending doom. They were trapped in a burning building, and that piece of paper was their only exit. I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment press down on their chests. I ignored the fraudulent release form on my plate. Instead, I reached down and grasped the handles of my leather satchel. I unzipped the main compartment with a loud, deliberate sound that sliced through the ambient noise of the steakhouse. I pulled out the stark red folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the table. I looked directly at Aunt Brenda and Uncle Thomas. I spoke with the perfectly modulated voice of a lead data analyst presenting a quarterly postmortem. I stated that transparency and honesty are the bedrock of any functioning household. Therefore, I felt it was my duty to provide them with the complete unfiltered data regarding why we were all sitting at this table tonight. Aunt Brenda offered a confused smile. Lydia lunged forward, grasping at the red folder, but I swiftly pinned it to the table with my forearm. I warned Lydia that attempting to destroy audit documents in front of multiple witnesses would only expedite her impending incarceration. The word incarceration hung over the booth like a guillotine. Uncle Thomas dropped his fork. Mr. Gable suddenly looked incredibly alert. I opened the red cover. I flipped to the first tab and slid a printed banking ledger toward Aunt Brenda. I established the baseline of their malicious behavior. I explained that just 48 hours ago, Lydia logged into a dormant joint checking account from my college years and initiated an unauthorized wire transfer. I watched Aunt Brenda read the transaction memo out loud. Back pay for raising you. I informed the table that my mother had stolen $12,000 of my emergency savings out of pure, petty spite simply because I had refused to hand over $500,000 of my inheritance that same morning. Chelsea tried to protest, but I cut her off. I flipped to the second tab and slid a stack of technical diagnostic reports toward Uncle Thomas. I detailed how Lydia and Trey, realizing they could not intimidate me into liquidating my trust fund, decided to execute a coordinated attack on my corporate career. I explained that they fabricated digital vendor invoices and sent an anonymous whistleblower email to my human resources department accusing me of white-collar embezzlement. Trey began shaking his head violently, his eyes wide with terror. He stammered that I had no proof. I smiled, my expression completely devoid of warmth. I informed the table that Trey had built his tech startup with outsourced code and possessed absolutely no fundamental understanding of cybersecurity. I explained that I personally pulled the Internet Protocol routing data from the anonymous email in front of my compliance director. I pointed to the printed diagnostic report highlighting the exact numerical sequence. I stated unequivocally that the malicious email traced directly back to the registered servers of Aura Health Innovations. Trey had digitally signed his own corporate execution order. Aunt Brenda gasped, pulling her hands back from the table as if it were suddenly electrified. Uncle Thomas stared at Trey with an expression of profound disgust. Mr. Gable began frantically packing his legal pad back into his battered briefcase. He realized instantly that he was sitting in the blast radius of a massive liability, but I was not finished. I flipped to the final tab in the red folder. I pulled out the commercial banking contracts and the forged signature pages. I laid them out so every single person at the table could see the embossed federal banking logo. I delivered the ultimate payload. I explained the true nature of their catastrophic financial collapse. I narrated how 6 months ago, Trey had run his Ponzi scheme straight into the ground and owed millions to violent, unregulated private lenders. I detailed how Lydia, stepping in to save her golden child's husband, committed textbook federal bank fraud. I pointed to the forged signature on the collateral pledge. I explained that Lydia had illegally leveraged my $1.5 million trust fund to secure a $1 million commercial bridge loan. I watched the exact moment Lydia's pristine matriarchal mask completely shattered. The muscles in her face went slack. Her jaw trembled, and the color completely drained from her skin, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. I explained the legal mechanism of my defense. I informed the table that on the morning of my 30th birthday, I had transferred every single dollar of my inheritance into an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. I explained that by moving the money, I had accidentally deleted the underlying collateral, securing Lydia's fraudulent federal loan. I pointed to the useless release form. I stated that this dinner was a desperate theatrical trap designed to trick me into retroactively authorizing her felony. They needed my signature tonight because the federal banking algorithms were currently flagging the unsecured $1 million liability. Mr. Gable did not say a single word. He grabbed his briefcase, slid out of the circular booth, and practically ran toward the restaurant exit, abandoning his clients entirely. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Aunt Brenda pressed her napkin over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Uncle Thomas looked at Lydia as if she were a complete stranger. The social pressure they were supposed to apply had completely evaporated, replaced by absolute revulsion. Trey let out a sound that was half sob and half gasp. He grabbed the table edge, swaying slightly as if he might pass out. Chelsea was weeping openly, her face buried in her hands, rocking back and forth in a state of total psychological collapse. Lydia stared at the forged banking documents, her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. She looked up at me, searching for any remaining shred of the obedient daughter she used to control previously. The absolute destruction was complete. I had exposed every lie, dismantled every trap, and completely neutralized their entire operation in under 5 minutes exactly. Trey slammed both of his hands down onto the pristine white tablecloth with such explosive force that the heavy silver cutlery rattled violently against the porcelain plates. The sudden aggressive movement was a desperate primitive attempt to reclaim control over a rapidly disintegrating situation. He leaned his tall frame across the table, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He completely abandoned his polished Silicon Valley vocabulary and resorted to raw, guttural threats. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and screamed that I was completely out of my mind. He yelled that a few printed spreadsheets and a forged signature proved absolutely nothing in the real world. He claimed that he would drag me through civil court for defamation and completely bankrupt me in legal fees for daring to slander his company in front of my family. He demanded that I pack up my fake audit and leave the restaurant immediately before he decided to get physically hostile. Chelsea grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down into the booth, but he shook her off violently. He leaned in closer, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wide and frantic. He hissed that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous spinster trying to ruin their perfect life. He told me that nobody cared about a technicality on a banking form and that my little display of corporate detective work was a pathetic joke. He threatened to call the police on me right then and there for corporate espionage and harassment. He demanded I hand over the red folder instantly. I did not flinch. I did not lean back into my chair. I maintained my perfectly rigid posture and looked up at his sweating, furious face. I felt a slow, deliberate smile spread across my lips. It was not a smile of joy. It was the absolute freezing cold smile of a predator watching a steel trap spring completely shut. I spoke softly, forcing him to strain to hear my words over the ambient noise of the crowded steakhouse. I told Trey that his fundamental problem was his complete inability to differentiate between a civil domestic dispute and a federal criminal mandate. I explained that he was still operating under the delusion that we were negotiating a family disagreement. I informed him that negotiations had permanently concluded the moment he stepped foot inside my apartment. I watched his eyes dart toward the red folder pinned under my arm. I told him to think very carefully about the sequence of events that occurred yesterday evening. I reminded him of the moment he stood in my hallway bragging about throwing my father's books into contractor trash bags and changing my deadbolt. I asked him if he honestly thought I just walked away from my own home out of fear. I asked him if he truly believed I was too intimidated to call the local police precinct to report an illegal eviction. Trey swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working frantically. He did not answer. The aggressive momentum was rapidly bleeding out of his posture. I delivered the reality check with surgical precision. I explained that calling a local police officer for a residential lock change would have merely resulted in a tedious civil misdemeanor citation. It would have been a minor slap on the wrist. I told him I had absolutely no interest in fighting a petty civil battle over a velvet sofa. I wanted absolute total obliteration. I informed him that instead of dialing 911 for a noise complaint, I took a cab directly to my attorney's office, and from there I did not go back to my hotel. I went straight to the Federal Risk Management Department of the exact national bank where Lydia had fraudulently secured his commercial loan. Lydia let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her throat as if she were physically choking on the oxygen in the dining room. I kept my eyes locked on Trey. I told him that I sat down with the regional director of federal compliance exactly 3 hours ago. I handed over the digital metadata proving his internet protocol address had been used to frame me. I handed over the recorded video of my apartment invasion. And most importantly, I handed over the complete unredacted forensic audit detailing the $1 million wire fraud and the forged collateral pledge. I explained that federal banks do not operate on standard business hours when they discover a 7-figure internal fraud sequence. They operate on an immediate emergency response protocol. I checked my watch. The gold hands indicated it was exactly 8:15 in the evening. I told Trey that the bank's federal liaison had immediately contacted the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I explained that executing a complex financial fraud against a federally insured institution utilizing the automated clearinghouse network is a Priority 1 felony. I informed him that the federal agents did not need to wait for a subpoena because I had willingly provided the raw, unassailable data proving the crime was currently active. Trey's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant tech founder completely vanished, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell. He slowly sank back down into the leather booth, his knees physically buckling under the crushing weight of the revelation. At that exact moment, the ambient lighting in the upscale steakhouse began to shift. The warm, flickering glow of the table candles and the heavy brass chandeliers was suddenly interrupted by a stark, violent rhythm of color. Brilliant flashes of sharp red and piercing blue light began reflecting off the polished glass entrance doors and the dark mahogany windowsills. The strobing lights cut through the elegant atmosphere of the dining room, casting long, erratic shadows across our table. Aunt Brenda and Uncle Thomas scrambled out of the booth, knocking over their water glasses, in their sheer desperation to distance themselves from the blast radius. They practically sprinted toward the kitchen corridors, terrified of being associated with a federal raid. Chelsea began screaming a high-pitched, continuous wail of pure animal panic. She curled into a tight ball on the leather seat, burying her face in her knees as the reality of her destroyed life finally caught up to her. Lydia sat perfectly still. She stared blankly at the red and blue lights flashing across her empty wine glass. The pristine matriarch who had carefully selected this highly visible center table to socially manipulate me was now trapped in her own public panopticon. The entire restaurant was watching her absolute downfall. She had absolutely nowhere left to run. The heavy glass doors at the front of the restaurant swung open with commanding force. The sophisticated chatter of the dining room died instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. 4 individuals walked through the entrance. 2 were uniformed police officers, their radios crackling softly in the quiet room. The other 2 were federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering printed across the back. They bypassed the host stand entirely. Their eyes scanned the crowded room with practiced tactical efficiency before locking directly onto our central circular booth. They began walking straight toward the table, their boots thudding heavily against the plush carpet. The checkmate was officially complete. The 4 officers closed the distance between the entrance and our circular booth with terrifying speed. The heavy thud of their boots against the carpet sounded like a countdown clock reaching absolute zero. The federal agents in their dark windbreakers did not look around at the wealthy patrons staring with open mouths. They kept their gaze locked entirely on the individuals sitting directly to my left. Trey tried to push himself backward into the leather upholstery, as if he could physically merge with the booth and disappear from the physical realm. Lydia remained frozen, a perfectly preserved statue of maternal arrogance slowly cracking under the weight of federal jurisdiction. The lead agent stopped inches from the white tablecloth. He did not introduce himself with a polite greeting. He looked down at the sweating, trembling man across from me and demanded to confirm his identity. Trey opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed. He managed a pathetic, jerky nod. The agent did not hesitate. He instructed Trey to stand up and step completely out of the booth. He announced in a voice that carried clearly across the silent dining room that Trey was being placed under immediate arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, operating an illicit financial syndicate, and defrauding federal banking institutions. Trey panicked. The arrogant tech visionary who had casually invaded my apartment and shattered my belongings earlier that week suddenly transformed into a cornered, desperate animal. He bumped the table violently, sending the crystal water glasses crashing onto the floor. He tried to scramble sideways, attempting to wedge himself past Chelsea and bolt toward the kitchen corridor. The two uniformed police officers anticipated the maneuver instantly. They closed the gap, grabbed him by both shoulders, and hauled him out of the booth with absolute professional force. They slammed him face down against the polished mahogany wall separating the dining areas. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the high-end steakhouse. It was the definitive sound of his entire fraudulent empire crashing into dust. The lead federal agent read Trey his rights, while the officers patted down his tailored charcoal blazer, extracting his smartphone and wallet. Trey began sobbing wildly, his face pressed against the dark wood paneling. He screamed that it was all a massive misunderstanding, that his investors were fully aware of the corporate risks, and that he was just a few days away from securing a massive software acquisition. He was still trying to pitch his fake company while wearing federal restraints. The officers simply turned him around, marched him straight through the center of the dining room, and out the heavy glass front doors. The patrons watched the disgraced tech founder being hauled away into the flashing neon lights of the police cruisers waiting at the curb. The second federal agent turned his attention directly to Lydia. The matriarch who had spent the last 30 years meticulously curating an image of absolute financial and social superiority was now the primary target of a federal fraud investigation. The agent informed her that she was not currently under formal arrest, but she was being detained for mandatory immediate questioning regarding a severely compromised commercial loan application. He specifically cited the submission of fraudulent collateral documents to a federally insured institution. He instructed her to gather her personal belongings and accompany him outside to a separate vehicle. Lydia attempted to deploy her ultimate defense mechanism. She tried to leverage her manufactured country club privilege. She pulled her shoulders back, raised her chin, and adopted a tone of fierce, indignant outrage. She informed the federal agent that he was making a catastrophic mistake. She threatened to call the chief of police, whom she claimed was a close personal family friend. She stated that this was a private domestic dispute orchestrated by her vindictive daughter and that she would not tolerate being publicly harassed in the middle of her dinner reservation. She demanded that the agent leave the restaurant instantly before she filed a massive civil lawsuit against his department. The federal agent did not even blink. He reached into his tactical jacket and pulled out a folded printed document. He held it up so Lydia could clearly see the federal seal and the signature of a federal magistrate judge. He informed her with chilling indifference that they had already seized the forged banking contracts from the risk management department. He stated that lying to a federal officer during an active fraud investigation would only upgrade her impending charges. He placed his hand hovering just above his utility belt and gave her one final absolute command to stand up and walk toward the exit voluntarily. The final remaining shreds of Lydia's delusion evaporated instantly. The terrifying reality of the United States justice system shattered her arrogant facade completely. She looked around the restaurant, realizing that every single one of her wealthy peers was actively watching her downfall. Her social currency had completely plummeted to zero. She reached for her designer handbag with violently trembling hands. She did not look at me. She did not look at Chelsea. She stood up, her legs shaking so badly she had to lean against the table for support. The agent escorted her away, leading the broken, disgraced matriarch out into the cold night air to face the terrifying consequences of her own boundless greed. Chelsea was left entirely alone in the booth. The pampered golden child who had worn my stolen jewelry and gleefully announced my illegal eviction was now utterly abandoned by the enablers who had shielded her from reality her entire life. Her husband was in the back of a police cruiser facing decades in federal prison. Her mother was being detained for massive banking fraud. Her stolen apartment was secured by a court order. She had absolutely no money, no shelter, and no functioning coping mechanisms. She slid out of the leather booth and collapsed onto the restaurant floor. She curled into a tight fetal position right next to the shattered crystal water glasses, weeping with loud, ragged, agonizing sobs. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute silence that followed the storm. The operation was a complete, flawless success. I had insulated my financial future, dismantled a dangerous criminal enterprise, and permanently neutralized my toxic family dynamics without raising my voice a single time. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed the cash squarely on the pristine white tablecloth, directly covering the spot where the forged release form had been sitting just 10 minutes ago. It was more than enough to cover my glass of sparkling water. I grasped the handles of my leather satchel, securing the red forensic audit folder safely inside. I picked up my tailored coat, stepped over the crying remnants of my sister, and walked out the front doors, leaving the toxic system burning in ashes behind me. 6 months passed with the quiet, predictable efficiency of a perfectly optimized algorithm. The chaotic, volatile variables that had once plagued my existence were permanently deleted from my personal dataset. I was sitting at my kitchen island, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the early morning sun. I held a ceramic mug of freshly brewed dark roast coffee, letting the subtle heat radiate through my palms. The apartment was completely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the city traffic 14 floors below. It was a beautiful, immaculate silence. The space around me looked entirely different from the disaster zone I had encountered on my 30th birthday. The tacky emerald green velvet sofa had been confiscated by the building management and hauled to the city dump hours after Trey was arrested. My custom shelving units were restored. My vintage watches were repaired and safely displayed in a new reinforced glass case. But the most significant change to my apartment was not cosmetic. It was foundational. Following the federal indictments against my mother and my brother-in-law, my trust attorney Harrison executed a ruthless legal sweep of all associated physical assets. Lydia had utilized a fraudulent joint deed to attempt her illegal eviction. When the federal prosecutors began liquidating her assets to satisfy the massive bank fraud penalties, Harrison filed an immediate civil claim. The presiding judge reviewed the overwhelming evidence of financial abuse and swiftly completely severed Lydia from the property deed. The apartment was now legally, entirely, and irrevocably solely in my name. The fortress was officially sealed. My professional life mirrored the absolute stability of my personal finances. The Human Resources Department at my health tech company did not merely close the investigation into the anonymous whistleblower complaint. The executive board reviewed my swift, analytical dismantling of the corporate sabotage and recognized a highly valuable asset. They realized that an employee who could calmly dissect a malicious cyber attack while under extreme personal duress was exactly the kind of unyielding leadership they required. 2 weeks after the incident at the steakhouse, I was officially promoted to senior product manager. I now oversaw a massive division of developers dictating the architectural flow of our most secure healthcare applications. My salary increased substantially, further compounding the aggressive financial growth of my protected trust fund. The federal justice system processed Lydia and Trey with the exact mechanical ruthlessness I had anticipated. Trey was completely denied bail due to his status as a high-flight risk. His fraudulent startup was liquidated by federal receivers, and he eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and federal banking deception. He was currently serving a lengthy sentence in a federal correctional facility, stripped of his designer suits and his arrogant delusions. Lydia faced a similarly devastating reality. The federal prosecutors aggressively seized every hidden account and liquidated her heavily mortgaged suburban home to cover the massive financial liabilities she had incurred. She avoided a lengthy prison sentence by accepting a restrictive plea deal that involved heavy restitution and strict federal probation, but her life as a wealthy country club matriarch was permanently eradicated. She was entirely bankrupt, socially ruined, and completely isolated. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark liquid sharpen my focus. I placed the ceramic mug down on the pristine granite countertop. The digital screen of my smartphone illuminated the quiet kitchen. The device vibrated against the stone surface, registering an incoming call from an unknown local number. I analyzed the data point. My personal phone number was highly restricted, given only to vetted professional contacts and my legal team. An unknown caller at this hour indicated a significant statistical probability of a desperate breach attempt. I picked up the device and swiped the screen to accept the connection. I brought the receiver to my ear and waited in absolute silence. A jagged, ragged breathing sound came through the speaker. It was a chaotic, wet noise that I recognized instantly. It was Chelsea. The former golden child was sobbing with a frantic, disorganized desperation. She had apparently borrowed a prepaid burner phone just to bypass the permanent block I had placed on her primary contact number. She began speaking in a rushed, panicked stream of consciousness, entirely abandoning any pretense of pride or entitlement. She cried that she had absolutely nothing left. She wailed that the Federal Asset Forfeiture Unit had seized her shared bank accounts and that she had been officially evicted from her temporary rental unit because she possessed absolutely no verifiable income. She was currently standing on a public sidewalk, holding 2 plastic bags filled with whatever clothes she could carry before the marshals locked the doors. She begged me for salvation. She pleaded with me to let her sleep on my couch just for a few weeks until she could figure out a plan. She attempted to deploy the exact same manipulation tactics she had used her entire life, invoking the concept of sisterhood and shared bloodlines. She cried that we were the only family each other had left, and that she was completely terrified of navigating the world without a financial safety net. She expected my biological programming to override my logic. She believed that witnessing her absolute destitution would trigger a dormant maternal instinct, compelling me to rescue her from the consequences of her own boundless ignorance and cruelty. I listened to her frantic, desperate pleading with total emotional sterility. I did not feel a single microgram of pity or guilt. I analyzed her current situation as the direct, unavoidable mathematical output of the malicious variables she had willingly introduced into my life. She had eagerly participated in my destruction when she thought she held the winning hand. Now that the board had been flipped, she expected a free pass. I waited for her to pause to draw a shaky, desperate breath. I spoke with a voice completely devoid of warmth, anger, or hesitation. It was the precise, flat tone of an automated system delivering a final, fatal error code. When you wore my dead father's necklace and threw my life onto the street, you stopped being my sister. I did not wait for her reaction. I did not want to hear the resulting explosion of panic or rage. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red disconnect button, terminating the connection instantly. I navigated straight to the incoming call log, selected the unknown burner number, and permanently added it to my blocked contacts list. I locked the screen and placed the device face down on the granite island. The digital quarantine was completely reestablished. I picked up my coffee mug and took another slow, quiet sip, looking out the expansive window at the vibrant morning city below. The toxic system had burned itself to ash, and I had emerged from the smoke entirely unscathed and completely free. I learned that protecting your money isn't greedy, it is protecting your self-worth. Blood does not give anyone the right to destroy your life. Have you ever had to use the law to stop a toxic family member? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The harrowing journey of Madeline dismantling her family's financial extortion reveals a profound truth about human relationships. Biological ties do not excuse psychological or financial abuse. For too long, society has peddled the dangerous narrative that family must be forgiven at all costs, demanding victims set themselves on fire to keep their toxic relatives warm. Madeline's clinical data-driven retaliation dismantles this outdated notion, proving that fiercely protecting your assets and your peace is the ultimate act of self-respect. We often mistake emotional manipulation for familial duty, allowing narcissistic parents and entitled siblings to drain our resources under the guise of loyalty. When Chelsea callously paraded around in her deceased father's necklace while overseeing her sister's illegal eviction, it was a glaring demonstration of how unchecked privilege breeds absolute cruelty. Madeline's triumph did not stem from explosive screaming matches or tearful interventions. Instead, it was born from the flawless execution of ironclad boundaries. By placing her inheritance into an irrevocable trust and utilizing federal compliance laws to her advantage, she transformed her perceived vulnerabilities into an impenetrable fortress. The core lesson here extends far beyond wealth management. You are never obligated to rescue people who are actively plotting to destroy you. Toxic individuals rely heavily on your empathy, your ingrained guilt, and your silence to sustain their parasitic lifestyles. Stripping them of this power requires viewing their manipulation as cold, hard data rather than an emotional obligation. When you stop reacting emotionally and start protecting yourself logically, the fraudulent empires they built will inevitably collapse under their own weight. True freedom arrives the exact moment you realize your worth is not defined by those who constantly seek to belittle you. Stand firm in your absolute truth, lock the doors against emotional extortion, and refuse to subsidize your own destruction.